Tonight, we begin with a question that is older than castles and twice as dangerous. What if falling in love could get you locked in a tower, exiled to a convent, or accused of witchcraft, all before breakfast? Welcome to the Middle Ages, where romance was a battlefield, and women were often the casualties. So fluff your pillow, dim the torchlight, and prepare to drift into a world where love was poetry, peril, and occasionally poultry-related scandal. Before you doze off into medieval mischief, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more sleepy scandals, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from, whether it's a cozy bed, a haunted castle, or a suspiciously quiet dungeon. In the medieval imagination, love was not a gentle breeze. It was a storm. A noble woman sighing at the moon might be seen as bewitched. A peasant girl caught smiling at a knight could be accused of seduction. And heaven forbid a widow should fall in love again. She might be labeled two-spirited, which was medieval code for probably possessed. Courtly love, the poetic ideal of noble romance, was all the rage in troubadour songs and castle gossip. But for real women, it was a trap wrapped in velvet. The rules were clear. Love must be secret, unconsummated, and preferably tragic. If it ended happily, it wasn't proper. If it ended in exile, scandal, or embroidery-based mourning, it was considered tasteful. The troubadours, those medieval singer-songwriters with questionable hygiene, wrote verses about unattainable ladies with swan-like necks and tragic destinies. These women were often married, unavailable, or locked in towers with nothing but a lute and a vague sense of doom. The men, meanwhile, rode around on horses, declaring their love in rhyming couplets and occasionally jousting for attention. But here's the twist. While the songs praised noble suffering, the real consequences of love were far less poetic. A woman who dared to love outside her arranged marriage could be punished, imprisoned, or quietly disappeared. Love was not a right, it was a risk. And the more passionate the affair, the more perilous the fallout. Take Lady Isolde of Thistlewick, a name I may or may not have invented for sleepy purposes. She fell in love with a traveling lute player named Barnaby, whose only talents were music and mild tax evasion. Their romance was discovered when Barnaby accidentally serenaded her beneath the wrong window. Her husband's. Isolde was sent to a convent. Barnaby was sent to the stocks. The lute was confiscated and repurposed as firewood. This was not unusual. In medieval society, women were expected to be obedient, modest, and romantically inert. Love was considered a distraction from their true duties, producing heirs, managing estates, and surviving childbirth. A woman who loved too boldly was seen as rebellious. A woman who loved too quietly was seen as suspicious. And a woman who didn't love at all, she was probably a nun or very clever. So as you settle into sleep, remember, in the Middle Ages, love was not a fairy tale. It was a gamble with high stakes and low odds. And for women, it was often the most dangerous game of all. In medieval Europe, marriage was less about soulmates and more about spreadsheets. If spreadsheets had been invented, which they hadn't, because math was still suspicious. For women, marriage was a transaction. A father would negotiate with another father, often over wine, goats, and the occasional passive-aggressive poem. The bride's opinion was rarely requested. Her dowry, however, was discussed in excruciating detail. How many acres? How many cows? Could she embroider? Could she produce heirs? Was she likely to run off with a lute player named Barnaby? These were the questions that mattered. Love, in this context, was a liability. A woman who fell in love with someone outside her arranged match risked ruining the deal. Worse, she might be labeled unmanageable, which was medieval code for has opinions, and opinions were dangerous, especially if they involved romance, poetry, or the idea that marriage should be enjoyable. Take the case of Lady Mildred of Soggyshire, a name I may or may not have invented for sleepy purposes. She was betrothed at age 12 to a man twice her age, who owned 3 pigs and a suspiciously large collection of tax scrolls. Mildred, however, fell in love with a traveling juggler named Hugo, whose only assets were charisma and a tendency to drop things. Their romance was discovered when Hugo accidentally juggled a flaming torch into the wedding cake. Mildred was married off immediately. Hugo was banned from Soggyshire. The cake was repurposed as a doorstop. This was not unusual. Medieval women were expected to marry strategically. A good match could elevate a family's status. A bad match could lead to scandal, ruin, or the dreaded social downgrade, which involved fewer parties and more goats. Love had no place in these calculations. It was considered frivolous, distracting, and occasionally contagious. Even queens weren't immune. Royal marriages were arranged to secure alliances, prevent wars, and occasionally confuse everyone involved. A princess might be sent across the continent to marry a man she'd never met, in a language she didn't speak, wearing a dress she couldn't breathe in. If she cried, it was considered charming. If she protested, it was considered treason. In the Middle Ages, marriage was a business, love was a risk, and for women, the safest way to survive the wedding was to smile, nod, and hope the pigs were friendly. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't just risky, it was spiritually suspicious. The church, ever vigilant and slightly dramatic, had a lot to say about passion. Mostly, don't, or at least, not too much, or at least, not while enjoying it. Desire, according to many medieval theologians, was a slippery slope that led directly to sin, scandal, and possibly spontaneous combustion. Women, in particular, were seen as the root of temptation. This was largely Eve's fault, and she was still getting bad press 1,000 years later. For medieval women, falling in love wasn't just a personal matter, it was a theological crisis. A woman who showed too much affection might be accused of lust. A woman who showed too little might be accused of pride. And a woman who showed affection to the wrong person, say a monk with excellent cheekbones, might be accused of heresy, witchcraft, or both, depending on the weather. The church promoted the idea of chaste love, which was like regular love, but with more guilt and fewer hugs. Passion was to be directed toward God, saints, or possibly one's husband, but only on feast days, and only if absolutely necessary. Anything else was considered morally hazardous and potentially contagious. Take the case of Sister Agnes of Candleford, a nun known for her embroidery and suspiciously poetic diary entries. She once wrote a verse comparing the Virgin Mary's eyes to those of a visiting friar. The friar was reassigned. Agnes was sent to scrub the chapel floor for 3 years. The diary was burned. The floor, however, sparkled. Even married women weren't safe. If a wife appeared too affectionate toward her husband, it raised eyebrows. Was she trying to manipulate him? Was she using feminine wiles? Was she enjoying herself? That last one was especially frowned upon. Enjoyment, after all, was a gateway sin. To protect society from the dangers of desire, the church issued guides, actual guides, on how to behave in marriage. These included helpful tips like avoid excessive eye contact, never kiss on feast days, and if you must feel affection, do so quietly and with appropriate remorse. In the Middle Ages, love letters were more dangerous than daggers. A single piece of parchment, folded with care and sealed with wax, could unravel reputations, ignite scandals, and get a woman locked in a tower faster than you could say, "Dear Sir." Romantic correspondence was a risky business. For medieval women, writing or receiving a love letter was like juggling fire while blindfolded. If the letter was discovered, it could be used as evidence of impropriety, rebellion, or witchcraft. If it wasn't discovered, it might still cause trouble, especially if it was accidentally delivered to the wrong person. This happened more often than you'd think, especially when servants were involved, and everyone had names like Edmund or Beatrice. The contents of these letters ranged from poetic sighs to scandalous metaphors involving falcons, roses, and occasionally turnips. Troubadours loved to compare women to celestial bodies, which was flattering but confusing. Your eyes are like twin moons might sound romantic, but it raised questions about gravity and visibility. Take the case of Lady Elfrida of Mossmere, who received a love letter from a knight named Cedric. The letter was hidden inside a pie, which was a common delivery method at the time. Unfortunately, the pie was intercepted by her husband, who mistook it for lunch. Upon discovering the letter, after biting into it, he declared Cedric a traitor, Elfrida a seductress, and the pie a cursed object. Cedric fled the kingdom. Elfrida was confined to her chambers. The pie was buried with honors. This was not unusual. To avoid detection, women developed clever methods of hiding their letters. Some stitched messages into embroidery. Others used invisible ink made from lemon juice, which worked well until someone lit a candle too close. A few brave souls whispered their words through keyholes, which was romantic, but acoustically unreliable. Privacy was a luxury few women had. Bedrooms were shared, doors were thin, and servants were nosy. A woman caught with a love letter might be interrogated, punished, or married off immediately to prevent further poetic outbursts. The safest option was silence or writing in code, which often made the letters unreadable, even to the intended recipient. Despite the risks, love letters persisted. They were a lifeline for women trapped in loveless marriages, distant castles, or convents with strict candle policies. The act of writing was an act of rebellion, a quiet declaration that feelings mattered, even if society disagreed. Knights were supposed to be noble, chivalrous, and slightly shiny. They were the medieval equivalent of celebrities, riding around in armor, rescuing damsels, and occasionally writing poetry that rhymed honor with armor. But for medieval women, falling in love with a knight was less fairy tale and more cautionary tale. The problem wasn't just the armor, which was loud, heavy, and difficult to cuddle. It was the consequences. A woman who fell for a knight risked scandal, exile, or being immortalized in a tragic ballad sung by a bard with questionable pitch control. Worse, if the knight was married, or a monk, The drama escalated faster than a jousting match at a wine festival. Knights were often bound by codes of chivalry, which included vague promises like protect the innocent and daunty flirt too much at banquets. But these codes were flexible, especially when poetry was involved. A knight might pledge eternal devotion to a lady, then ride off to pledge eternal devotion to someone else. It was romantic, confusing, and occasionally treasonous. Consider the tale of Lady Beatrix of Fernhollow, who fell for Sir Reginald the Reckless. He was brave, bold, and had a habit of reciting love poems during sword fights. Their romance bloomed in secret, mostly in the stables, which smelled of hay and poor decisions. When discovered, Beatrix was sent to a distant cousin's estate for reflection. Reginald was reassigned to dragon duty, which was medieval code for go fight something large and scaly. The stables were fumigated. This was not unusual. Forbidden love between women and knights was a popular theme in medieval literature, but in real life, it was a recipe for disaster. Families feared scandal. The church feared sin, and knights feared commitment. A woman caught in such a romance might be punished, married off, or forced to take a vow of silence, which was difficult, especially if she had opinions about dragons. Even when the love was mutual, the risks remained. A knight might be excommunicated, a woman might be disinherited, and if the affair produced a child, the consequences multiplied, especially if the child inherited the knight's tendency to recite poetry during mealtimes. In the quiet halls of medieval convents, love didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. For many women, the cloister was a refuge from arranged marriages, scandalous nights, and the exhausting business of being politically useful. But even behind stone walls and beneath layers of woolen habits, the heart remained stubbornly romantic. Nuns were expected to renounce worldly desires. Their vows included poverty, chastity, and obedience, 3 things that made love particularly inconvenient. Yet history is full of whispers, poems, and embroidered initials that suggest the cloistered life was not entirely devoid of longing. Some nuns wrote verses so tender they could melt candle wax. Others composed hymns that sounded suspiciously like love songs. A few even exchanged secret letters with monks, friars, or the occasional visiting scholar who looked like he'd stepped out of a stained glass window. These romances were rarely consummated, but they were deeply felt and deeply frowned upon. Take Sister Clarissa of Windermere, known for her illuminated manuscripts and her habit of drawing saints with unusually handsome jawlines. She once embroidered a tapestry depicting the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian, but observers noted that Sebastian looked suspiciously like Brother Thomas, the monastery's beekeeper. Clarissa was reassigned to vegetable duty. Thomas was sent to a distant abbey. The tapestry was quietly misplaced. This was not unusual. Convents were places of discipline, but also of creativity. Women who had been denied education, autonomy, or artistic expression often found their voices within cloistered walls. They painted, wrote, and sang, not always about God. Some composed allegories, where the divine light bore a striking resemblance to a certain friar's smile. Others wrote devotional texts that doubled as emotional diaries. Of course, not all cloistered love was romantic. Some nuns formed deep bonds of friendship, sisterhood, and shared rebellion. They supported each other through fasting, prayer, and the occasional theological debate that ended in passive-aggressive embroidery. These relationships, though platonic, were powerful, and sometimes just as threatening to the social order. The Church, ever vigilant, issued warnings about excessive affection between nuns. Hugs were monitored, letters were censored, and any sign of emotional intensity was met with suspicion. A nun who cried too often might be sent to solitary reflection. A nun who laughed too loudly might be asked to explain herself. A nun who did both, she was probably Clarissa. In the grand tapestry of medieval scandal, few threads are as feathered and confusing as the infamous chicken trial of 1327. It began, as many medieval dramas did, with a woman, a knight, and a poultry-related misunderstanding. Lady Gwendolen of Cluckminster, whose name was either prophetic or deeply unfortunate, was known for her beauty, her wit, and her suspiciously affectionate relationship with a prize-winning hen named Matilda. The hen was no ordinary bird. She had glossy feathers, a regal strut, and a tendency to appear during romantic encounters. This, as you might imagine, raised eyebrows. One day, Sir Percival the Pompous, a knight with a flair for dramatic entrances and questionable poetry, accused Gwendolen of using Matilda to cast a love spell on him. He claimed that every time he saw the hen, he felt an uncontrollable urge to write sonnets and sigh dramatically near windows. Naturally, the local clergy took this very seriously. A trial was convened. Gwendolen was charged with emotional sorcery, a vague but popular accusation at the time. Matilda was charged with being an accomplice. The courtroom was packed. The hen was placed on a tiny stool. Witnesses testified that they had seen Gwendolen whispering to Matilda, feeding her enchanted breadcrumbs, and once, horrifyingly, braiding her tail feathers. Gwendolen defended herself with grace and sarcasm. She claimed the hen was simply a good listener. The judge, who had recently been jilted by a woman with a pet duck, was unmoved. Matilda, for her part, remained silent, which was interpreted as guilt. The verdict: Gwendolen was exiled to a convent with strict poultry restrictions. Matilda was sentenced to relocation, specifically to the bishop's kitchen. Sir Percival wrote a final sonnet titled Ode to a Bewitched Drumstick, and vowed never to love again unless enchanted. This was not entirely unusual. Medieval Europe had a complicated relationship with animals and affection. Cats were sometimes seen as witches' familiars. Dogs were considered loyal, but suspicious. Birds, especially ones that showed up during romantic moments, were viewed with deep theological concern. Women who kept pets were often accused of emotional manipulation. A dove in the garden might be a symbol of purity, or a sign of secret flirtation. A squirrel in the sleeve could be a fashion statement, or a demonic messenger. The line between companionship and conspiracy was thin, and often determined by how bored the local clergy were. In the Middle Ages, love was risky, but love combined with charisma, herbal tea, and a suspiciously well-timed thunderstorm, that was witchcraft. Medieval society had a habit of blaming women for things they couldn't explain, like crop failure, sudden rain, and knights falling in love without permission. If a woman was charming, clever, or owned a cat, she was already halfway to being accused of sorcery. Add romance to the mix, and she might as well start packing for trial. Witchcraft and wooing were often tangled together in the medieval imagination. A woman who knew how to make eye contact, mix herbs, or write poetry was considered suspicious. If she also happened to be unmarried, lived near a forest, or had a mole in an inconvenient location, the village council would start sharpening their pitchforks. Take the tale of Maribel of Fogfen, a healer known for her calming teas and her tendency to make knights blush. One day, Sir Alric, the easily impressed, declared his undying love for her after drinking a cup of her chamomile blend. The local priest, who had recently burned his tongue on nettle soup, accused Maribel of enchantment. She was put on trial. The tea was confiscated. Alric was sent to a monastery to cool off. This was not unusual. Romantic attraction, when directed at the wrong woman, was often blamed on magic. It couldn't possibly be her intelligence, her kindness, or her ability to play the lute without breaking a string. No, it had to be a spell, a potion, a hex, something unnatural, something feminine. The church issued warnings about love magic, which included everything from scented oils to suggestive glances. Women were told to avoid perfumes, mirrors, and dancing, especially if they looked like they were enjoying it. A woman who danced too well might be accused of summoning spirits. A woman who danced poorly might be accused of trying to distract the clergy. Even innocent gestures could be misinterpreted. A flower tucked behind the ear, witchcraft. A smile at the market, sorcery. A compliment about someone's tunic, clearly a spell designed to unravel the moral fabric of society. To protect themselves, many women downplayed their talents. They avoided singing, storytelling, and anything that might be considered bewitching. Some even pretended to be less intelligent, less charming, or less interested in love, just to stay safe. It was a quiet rebellion, stitched into silence. In the Middle Ages, virginity wasn't just a personal matter. It was a full-blown economic asset. For medieval women, purity was currency. It could buy a better marriage, secure a higher dowry, and protect a family's reputation from the ever-looming threat of gossip, scandal, and dramatic harp music. Virginity was tracked with the intensity of a royal ledger. Families guarded it like treasure. Priests preached about it like it was a sacred relic, and suitors inquired about it with the subtlety of a tax collector. A woman's worth, in many circles, was measured not by her wit, wisdom, or embroidery skills, but by whether she had successfully avoided romantic entanglements and suspicious glances. This created a strange and stressful economy, where love was dangerous because it threatened the balance sheet. A single kiss could devalue a dowry. A flirtatious glance could spark a family feud, and a secret romance, especially one involving a lute player named Barnaby, could result in exile, confinement, or a sudden trip to a convent with very few windows. Consider the tale of Lady Petronilla of Bramblegate, whose virginity was so prized that her family hired a full-time chaperone named Mildred, whose only job was to stand nearby and glare at anyone with romantic intentions. Mildred once tackled a poet who tried to rhyme Petronilla with Thrilla. The poet was banned. Petronilla was married off. Mildred was promoted. This was not unusual. The obsession with virginity led to some truly bizarre customs. Some families required physical proof, an unsettling concept that involved bedsheets, witnesses, and a level of awkwardness best left unspoken. Others relied on testimonials, which were essentially medieval Yelp reviews of a woman's chastity. 5 stars, very modest, rarely speaks, avoids eye contact. The church, of course, had strong opinions. Virginity was considered holy, desirable, and deeply symbolic. Saints were often depicted as pure, untouched, and vaguely glowing. Women who lost their virginity outside of marriage were seen as fallen, flawed, or in need of immediate repentance, preferably involving fasting, prayer, and a long walk in uncomfortable shoes. This created a paradox. Women were expected to be desirable, but not too desirable, attractive, but not seductive, romantic, but only in theory. The ideal woman was a walking contradiction, lovely, silent, and completely uninterested in love. In the medieval marketplace of matrimony, love was optional, but a dowry was non-negotiable. For women, the dowry was both a ticket to marriage and a trapdoor to lifelong obligation. It was a bundle of wealth, land, livestock, linens, and occasionally a suspiciously shaped candlestick, meant to sweeten the deal for the groom. But beneath the surface, it was a system that turned affection into accounting. A woman's dowry was carefully calculated, often before she could spell her own name. Fathers negotiated with other fathers, scribes took notes, and somewhere in the background, the bride-to-be practiced smiling politely while wondering what a bushel of barley had to do with her future happiness. The bigger the dowry, the better the match. A generous dowry could land a noble husband a castle with decent plumbing and a lifetime supply of embroidered tablecloths. A modest dowry might result in a goat-owning baron with halitosis and a fondness for tax scrolls. Love, in either case, was not part of the equation. Take the tale of Lady Euphemia of Gravelshire, whose dowry included 3 cows, a silver goblet, and a tapestry depicting Saint Ursula riding a unicorn. Euphemia fell in love with a baker named Giles, who had no cows, no goblets, and only one tapestry of a loaf of bread. Her family forbade the match. Giles was declared economically unsuitable. Euphemia was married off to a man who once tried to tax a thunderstorm. The cows were delighted. This was not unusual. The dowry trap worked both ways. If a woman's dowry was too small, she might remain unmarried, which was considered socially awkward and spiritually suspicious. If her dowry was too large, she might be married off quickly, often to someone who valued her assets more than her personality. And if she fell in love with someone who didn't meet the financial criteria, she risked scandal, shame, and a lifetime of embroidery. Even after marriage, the dowry could haunt a woman. If the marriage ended through death, divorce, or dramatic jousting accident, her dowry might be withheld, contested, or absorbed into her husband's estate. Legal battles over dowries were common, confusing, and occasionally involved monks with strong opinions about sheep. The church, ever helpful, encouraged modesty in dowries, but also emphasized their importance. A woman's virtue was praised, but her value was often measured in coin. Love, meanwhile, was relegated to the margins, acceptable only if it didn't interfere with the financial paperwork. In the medieval world, music was magic. A well-played lute could soften hearts, stir emotions, and, if strummed at the wrong moment, cause a scandal so dramatic it required 3 bishops and a mop. For women, falling in love with a musician was especially risky, not because of the music itself, but because of what it represented: freedom, feeling, and the possibility of dancing without permission. Troubadours and minstrels roamed the countryside like medieval pop stars, armed with instruments, rhymes, and questionable hygiene. They sang of love, loss, and ladies with eyes like moonlight and ankles like destiny. Their songs were poetic, passionate, and often completely impractical. But for women trapped in arranged marriages or cloistered lives, those melodies were a lifeline, a reminder that romance existed, even if only in verse. Take the tale of Lady Isadora of Thimblewick, who fell for a lute player named Benoit. He had curly hair, a tragic backstory, and a tendency to rhyme Isadora with Flora. Their secret meetings took place in the orchard, beneath a tree that leaned just enough to suggest complicity. When their romance was discovered, thanks to a nosy squirrel and a misplaced sonnet, Isadora was sent to her Aunt S estate for moral recalibration. Benoit was banned from performing within a 50-mile radius. The squirrel was promoted to castle lookout. This was not unusual. Music was considered dangerous because it stirred the soul. The church warned against sensual melodies, which included anything with rhythm, harmony, or joy. Women were especially discouraged from enjoying music too much. A lady who hummed might be accused of longing. A lady who danced might be accused of rebellion. A lady who sang, witchcraft, obviously. Despite the risks, music flourished. Women composed songs in secret, wrote lyrics in the margins of prayer books, and memorized melodies passed down like heirlooms. Some even learned to play instruments, quietly, in attics, with the windows closed and the cat sworn to secrecy. Romantic songs were the most dangerous. They spoke of forbidden love, stolen glances, and the kind of passion that made embroidery seem dull. A woman who listened too closely might start dreaming. A woman who dreamed too boldly might start writing. And a woman who wrote? Well, that was practically treason. In the Middle Ages, passion was considered contagious, like a fever, but with more poetry and fewer remedies. And when actual plagues swept through towns, some people blamed not rats, not hygiene, not the suspicious soup, but love. The logic was medieval at best. If a woman fell in love and then someone nearby got sick, clearly her emotions had triggered divine punishment. Passion, they believed, weakened the soul, distracted the mind, and possibly invited airborne curses. It was the emotional equivalent of sneezing in church. Take the tale of Eleanor of Bramblegate, who fell in love with a traveling scholar named Hugo the Hesitant. Their romance bloomed during spring, alongside a mysterious rash that spread through the village. Hugo was blamed. Eleanor was quarantined. The rash turned out to be caused by a new laundry soap. Hugo left town. The soap was banned. This was not unusual. During outbreaks of plague, women were often accused of stirring unrest with their feelings. A widow who remarried too quickly? Suspicious. A maiden who blushed at a knight? Dangerous. A nun who wrote a romantic hymn? Definitely the cause of boils. The church encouraged restraint, silence, and a complete lack of visible affection, just to be safe. Some towns even issued temporary bans on dancing, singing, and courtship. Love letters were confiscated. Perfume was discouraged, and anyone caught smiling too warmly might be asked to explain themselves to a monk with a very large book. Of course, passion didn't actually cause plague, but in a world desperate for explanations, romance was an easy scapegoat. It was unpredictable, emotional, and, worst of all, difficult to regulate. And for medieval women, expressing love during a time of illness was like lighting a candle in a windstorm, brave, beautiful, and likely to be extinguished. Still, love persisted. Women wrote poems in secret, embroidered initials into handkerchiefs, and whispered sweet nothings through closed windows. Even as fear spread, so did affection, quietly, stubbornly, and sometimes with excellent penmanship. In the medieval imagination, love was a mysterious force, unpredictable, powerful, and occasionally drinkable. Love potions were whispered about in taverns, scribbled into herbal manuals, and blamed for everything from sudden infatuation to suspicious poetry. For women, dabbling in love potions was a dangerous game, equal parts romance and risk, with a dash of rosemary. The idea was simple: mix a few herbs, chant a few words, and voila, instant affection. The reality was more complicated. Most potions were made from ingredients like honey, mint, and questionable mushrooms. Some included animal parts. Others relied on timing, moonlight, and the belief that stirring counterclockwise increased passion. It didn't. It just made the potion taste like regret. Take the tale of Odilia of Marshmere, a young apothecary's apprentice with a fondness for experimentation and a crush on the local falconer. She brewed a potion using rose petals, cinnamon, and something she thought was romantic moss. She slipped it into his mead. He fell in love with the mead. Odilia was heartbroken. The falconer opened a tavern. The moss was later identified as lint. This was not unusual. Love potions were often blamed when relationships went awry. If a nobleman fell for a commoner, it must have been a potion. If a monk wrote a sonnet, clearly enchanted. If a woman smiled too warmly, someone had slipped something into the soup. The church frowned upon all of it. Love, they insisted, should be pure, divine, and preferably boring. Women who brewed or used love potions risked being labeled witches, seductresses, or emotionally ambitious. Trials were held. Potions were confiscated. Recipes were burned. And yet, the allure remained. Because in a world where marriages were arranged, emotions were regulated, and romance was considered suspicious, a love potion offered something rare: choice. Of course, most potions didn't work. Some caused hiccups, others induced sneezing. A few led to temporary affection for livestock, but the dream persisted that with the right blend of herbs and hope, love could be summoned, shaped, and maybe even enjoyed. In the Middle Ages, towers weren't just architectural features, they were emotional holding cells. For medieval women, falling in love with the wrong person could result in confinement, isolation, and a view of the countryside that never changed. The tower was society's way of saying, "We disapprove of your feelings, but we'll give you a nice window." Romantic rebellion was rarely tolerated. A noblewoman who defied her arranged marriage, exchanged secret letters, or, heaven forbid, ran off with a bard named Hugo, might find herself locked away for reflection. Reflection, in this case, meant embroidery, prayer, and listening to birds mock her from the windowsill. Take the tale of Lady Isabel of Greystone, who fell in love with a scribe named Roland. He had ink-stained fingers, a dreamy gaze, and a habit of quoting poetry at livestock. Their romance was discovered when Roland accidentally wrote a love sonnet on a tax document. Isabel was confined to the East Tower. Roland was reassigned to inventory scrolls about grain. The sonnet was filed under miscellaneous. This was not unusual. Towers were used to protect reputations, enforce obedience, and discourage further romantic adventures. Some women spent weeks inside, others spent years. A few became legends, mysterious figures glimpsed through narrow windows, rumored to be writing epic poems or training carrier pigeons to deliver love notes. Life in the tower was quiet, but not peaceful. Meals were delivered by servants who whispered gossip. Letters were smuggled in loaves of bread, and every creak of the stone walls reminded the occupant that love, while beautiful, was also deeply inconvenient. The church approved of such measures. Isolation was seen as a path to repentance. A woman who had loved too boldly could reflect, pray, and hopefully emerge with fewer opinions. Towers were considered merciful alternatives to harsher punishments, like exile, public shaming, or being forced to marry someone who collected beetles. Some women used their confinement creatively. They wrote poetry, composed songs, or embroidered tapestries that subtly mocked their captors. Others stared out the window and imagined a world where love wasn't punished with architecture. A few even escaped, usually with help from sympathetic maids, clever disguises, and an unusually cooperative goat. In the annals of medieval mischief, few names shimmer with scandal quite like Eleanor the Bold. She was clever, outspoken, and most dangerously romantic. In a world where women were expected to whisper, Eleanor spoke in sonnets, and for that, she was put on trial. Her crime, loving too loudly. Eleanor was born into a noble family, with a fondness for rules and a deep distrust of metaphors. She read poetry, debated monks, and once corrected a bishop's Latin mid-sermon. But her greatest offense came when she fell in love with a knight named Tristan, who had excellent posture and a tendency to quote Virgil during sword fights. Their romance was the stuff of troubadour dreams, secret meetings in the orchard, coded messages hidden in embroidery, and one particularly dramatic moment involving a spilled goblet and a spontaneous declaration of love in front of a tapestry depicting Saint Jerome. The tapestry was scandalized when word of their affair reached the local council via a servant with a flair for gossip and a suspiciously good memory. Eleanor was summoned to court, not for theft, not for treason, but for emotional disruption of the social order, a charge so vague it required 3 scrolls to define. The trial was held in the Great Hall, beneath a chandelier that had seen better centuries. Eleanor stood tall, dressed in crimson, a color reserved for feast days and defiance. The judges, all men with impressive beards and limited patience, asked her to explain herself. She did, in verse. Her defense included metaphors, historical references, and a passionate argument about the nature of love and liberty. The audience was moved. The judges were confused. One fainted, another demanded a glossary. In the end, Eleanor was found guilty, not of love, but of being excessively articulate. Her sentence, confinement in the West Tower with limited access to ink. This was not unusual. Women who challenged norms, especially through romance, were often punished not for what they did, but for how boldly they did it. Eleanor's trial became legend, whispered in convents, embroidered into shawls, and occasionally reenacted by rebellious nuns with excellent dramatic timing. In the tower, Eleanor continued to write. Her poems were smuggled out by sympathetic maids and one unusually literate pigeon. Her words spread across the region, inspiring other women to question, to dream, and to rhyme without permission. In the Middle Ages, becoming a widow was supposed to be the end of romance, a quiet descent into black veils, solemn sighs, and a lifetime of being referred to as the late Lord's wife. But for many women, widowhood came with its own set of woes, and a surprising number of unsolicited marriage proposals. A widow was expected to mourn with dignity. This meant no laughter, no color, and definitely no dancing. Her grief was to be public, performative, and preferably poetic. If she cried too little, she was cold. If she cried too much, she was dramatic. And if she didn't cry at all, witchcraft, obviously. But the real trouble began when the mourning period ended, or didn't. Widows were often caught in a strange limbo, no longer married, but not quite free. Their property was contested, their choices were scrutinized, and their romantic interests deeply inconvenient. Take the tale of Lady Sibylla of Thornwick, whose husband died tragically during a chess match involving a poorly timed sneeze. Sibylla, now in possession of a modest estate and a very judgmental goose, chose not to remarry. Instead, she took up gardening, wrote melancholic poetry, and hosted quiet dinners where no one was allowed to mention chess. Suitors came and went. Sibylla remained single. The goose remained unimpressed. This was not unusual. Widows who refused to remarry were often seen as suspicious. Were they hiding something? Were they secretly in love with someone unsuitable? Were they enjoying their independence? That last one was especially alarming. A woman who enjoyed solitude was clearly up to something. The church encouraged widows to remain chaste and devoted to prayer. Manuals offered advice like avoid mirrors, limit laughter, and do not wear shoes that suggest optimism. A widow who smiled at a merchant might be accused of flirtation. A widow who hosted a feast might be accused of celebration. A widow who did both? She was probably Sibylla. Even those who wanted to remarry faced challenges. Their dowries were smaller, their reputations were complicated, and their suitors were often either too old, too ambitious, or too fond of chess. Love, once again, was a risk. And for widows, it came with extra paperwork. In the Grand Museum of Medieval Myths, few artifacts are as infamous or as misunderstood as the chastity belt. Supposedly forged in iron and fastened with moral panic, the chastity belt has become a symbol of how far society was willing to go to keep love locked up. But for medieval women, the real story was less about metal and more about metaphor. The idea was simple. If you couldn't trust your wife, your daughter, or your niece not to fall in love, you could always trust a padlock. Or so the theory went. Chastity belts were rumored to be worn by noble women, while their husbands went off to war, crusades, or extended pilgrimages that suspiciously resembled vacations. The belts were said to prevent temptation, preserve virtue, and make sitting down a logistical nightmare. But here, the twist. Most historians agree that chastity belts were probably more symbolic than practical. The few surviving examples are either theatrical props, later inventions, or deeply uncomfortable jokes. Still, the myth persisted because the fear behind it was very real. Take the tale of Lady Honoria of Lochmere, whose husband commissioned a belt made of silver, engraved with the words, "Faithful forever." Honoria, who had a strong sense of irony and a secret stash of poetry, wore it once for a portrait. Then she hung it on the wall and told visitors it was a decorative fruit bowl. Her husband never noticed. The fruit, however, was deeply confused. This was not unusual. The chastity belt became a symbol of control, an imagined solution to the imagined problem of female desire. It represented the belief that women couldn't be trusted with their own hearts, and that love, if left unchecked, would lead to chaos, scandal, and possibly dancing. The church, ever enthusiastic about restraint, praised the concept. Sermons warned against temptation. Manuals offered advice on modesty, silence, and avoiding eye contact with anyone who owned a lute. The chastity belt fit neatly into this narrative, whether it existed or not. For women, the pressure to remain pure was constant. Their behavior was monitored. Their clothing was scrutinized. Their friendships were questioned. And their romantic feelings, best left unspoken, unwritten, and unacted upon. The chastity belt may have been a myth, but the restrictions were very real. Some women resisted quietly. They wrote poetry, embroidered secrets, or told stories that disguised rebellion as allegory. Others played along, smiling politely, while dreaming of a world where love didn't require a key. In the quiet corridors of medieval convents, love was supposed to be a distant memory, something renounced, resisted, and replaced with prayer. But sometimes, even the thickest stone walls couldn't keep the heart from wandering, and when it did, the consequences were embroidered in scandal. Nuns were expected to devote themselves entirely to God. Their vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty were taken seriously, especially by the clergy, who monitored emotions like suspicious soup ingredients. A nun who smiled too often, lingered too long near the garden, or hummed a secular tune might be accused of excessive warmth, which was medieval code for possibly romantic. Enter Sister Benedicta of Rosevale, known for her devotion, her beautiful singing voice, and her unfortunate habit of writing love poems in Latin. She fell in love with Brother Lucian, a visiting monk who smelled faintly of parchment and existential dread. Their connection was forged over shared scripture, stolen glances, and a mutual appreciation for illuminated manuscripts. One day, Benedicta slipped a poem into Lucien's psalter. It read, "Thy eyes are holier than relics, thy voice more soothing than Gregorian chant." Lucien, overwhelmed and slightly flustered, dropped the book into a baptismal font. The poem was discovered. Benedicta was reassigned to candle duty. Lucien was sent to a monastery known for its silence. The psalter was dried and reclassified as emotionally compromised. This was not unusual. Romantic feelings in convents were considered dangerous, not just because of the vows, but because they disrupted the delicate balance of spiritual focus and social control. A nun who loved too much might inspire others. She might write songs. She might question the rules, and questioning the rules was the fastest way to end up scrubbing floors with holy water. Some nuns expressed their feelings through art. They painted saints with suspiciously familiar features. They embroidered flowers that bloomed only in the presence of certain monks. They wrote allegories where the divine messenger bore a striking resemblance to Brother Lucian. These works were praised for their beauty and quietly confiscated. The church responded with guidelines. Nuns were advised to avoid eye contact, limit conversation, and never, under any circumstances, exchange baked goods with male visitors. Love, they insisted, was for God alone, Anything else was distraction, temptation, or a recipe for theological drama. For 20 chapters, we've wandered through candlelit corridors, whispered through convent walls, and tiptoed past scandalous chickens. We've met nuns who loved too much, widows who loved too freely, and maidens who loved too soon. And through it all, one truth remained. In the Middle Ages, love was dangerous, especially for women. It wasn't the kind of danger with swords or dragons. It was quieter, slower, woven into rules, stitched into tapestries, and preached from pulpits. A woman's heart was watched, weighed, and often silenced. Her feelings were considered risky, her desires inconvenient, her romances punishable. And yet, she loved. She loved in secret gardens and behind locked towers. She loved through poetry, embroidery, and glances that lasted just a moment too long. She loved boldly, quietly, rebelliously. And though her love rarely changed the world, it changed her. And sometimes that was enough. The legacy of dangerous love isn't written in royal decrees or dusty scrolls. It lives in the margins, in the verses tucked between prayers, in the initials hidden in lace, in the stories passed down, not by historians, but by grandmothers with knowing smiles. So, as you close your eyes tonight, remember Lady Isabel, Sister Benedicta, Eleanor the Bold, and all the women who dared to feel in a time that feared feeling. Their love may have been forbidden, but it was never forgotten. Sleep softly now. The candles are low, the tapestries are quiet, and the stories, well, they'll wait for you. Good night. In the grand saga of medieval romance, some loves were legendary, etched into stained glass, sung by bards, and blamed for wars. But most loves, quiet, fleeting, forgotten. And for many medieval women, love didn't change everything. It changed nothing. This was the kind of love that bloomed in the margins. A glance across the market, a shared smile during vespers, a poem slipped between pages of scripture. It was tender, sincere, and completely powerless against the machinery of marriage contracts, family alliances, and the church's deep suspicion of happiness. Take the tale of Eleonora of Mossmere, a merchant's daughter who fell for a young scholar named Thomas. He read aloud in Latin, smelled faintly of ink, and once compared her eyes to the clarity of a well-organized scroll. They met in secret, exchanged riddles, and dreamed of a life filled with books and bread. But Eleonora's father had already arranged her marriage to a man who exported barrels and disliked metaphors. Thomas left for a monastery. Eleonora married. The scrolls remained unorganized. This was not unusual. Love, for medieval women, was rarely enough. It couldn't override dowries, defy fathers, or rewrite laws. A woman might love deeply, bravely, even brilliantly, but still find herself married to someone chosen for her, living a life designed by others. Her feelings were real. Her choices were not. The church praised restraint. Manuals advised women to guard their hearts, avoid romantic stories, and never trust a man who played the lute. Love was considered dangerous because it inspired hope, and hope, in a rigid society, was a rebellious act. Some women resisted quietly. They wrote verses in the margins of cookbooks. They embroidered initials into sleeves. They told stories that disguised truth as fiction. But even these small rebellions rarely changed their fate. The world around them remained unmoved, unimpressed, and deeply invested in keeping things exactly as they were. And yet, the love endured. It lived in memory, in whispered tales, in the way a woman paused while passing the orchard where she once laughed. It didn't change her life, but it changed her, just a little.